Welcome to the MTC Report, the news behind the news with journalist Mark Taylor-Canfield. We offer you independent voices and underreported stories about topics you won't hear anywhere else. Join us as we delve into the deeper issues behind the news stories of the day on the MTC Report.
Hi, this is Mark Taylor-Canfield, and this is the MTC Report. For those of you who don't know who I am, I'm a musician and a journalist, actor and writer. I've written at the Huffington Post. I've actually been published in the Seattle Times. I write a blog at Daily Kos and a column at the Capitol Hill Times. I'm a regular guest on the Jeff Santos Show, broadcasting from Boston on the Revolution Radio Network. And I'm also director of Democracy Watch News, which is a pro-democracy movement news agency, which follows pro-democracy movements around the world. So you can check out all of my stuff at Twitter or Facebook or on YouTube, where this is posted. We have about 400, getting close to 400 original videos now posted at this YouTube channel. And today I wanted to talk to you about something very dear to my heart, which is democracy. That's right, the United States of America, which is supposed to be a democratic republic. And if you look into where that word came from, res publica. That's right, it was a Latin term that was used in the early empire of Rome, when the early civilization of Rome, actually, after some kings had done some very unsavory things, and there had been a lot of decisions being made behind closed doors with an elite group of people. Well, the Roman people rebelled, and they decided that res publica, all government operations and all government business should be done in the open, in the public. That's what res publica means. That's where the word republic came from. So, in the open forum, right, where everyone can see what's going on and who voted on what, right? How about some voting, where people get to choose representatives and take some responsibility for their own governance? That's right, folks. That's a big part of what democracy is. It's not just about having freedoms, freedom of speech, freedom of assembly, freedom of religion, freedom of privacy to your possessions and papers, but it also means that you have to take some responsibility for your own governance. Right, that's why people need to be involved in the political system. If you have an apathetic public who doesn't involve themselves in what they consider to be a corrupt system, electoral system, controlled by the wealthy elites, then you don't have a democracy. You have a failed democracy, which many may argue is what's happening in the United States of America. Yes, that's right. We have a broken democracy, and so our task now is to fix it. Democracy Watch News covers pro-democracy movements around the world, and I can tell you, as the one of the editors and the director of that organization, that yes, America has some big problems. We are ranked 41st in the world in terms of press freedom by Reporters Without Borders. That's one issue that I have. As an American journalist, I'm not proud of that fact. As a U.S. journalist, I'm not proud of that fact. We also have a lot of other things that Americans, with their exceptionalist attitude, don't want to either think about or admit. That a lot of we also have other things about our country that a lot of Americans don't want to face up to because of our sense of exceptionalism, which has been, you know, the status quo here in the United States for a long time, where we're exceptional. We don't have to play by the rules, right? Well, guess what? We have a high infant mortality rate. We have a lot of people who don't have health insurance because we have no universal or single-payer health insurance in this country. A lot of people who aren't very educated because they can't afford to go to college. So there's a lot of situations in the United States where we actually rank low on international lists, but we don't really want to talk about it here, right? Nobody in the mainstream media wants to talk about freedom of the press, which is why they do not allow me to write articles for them about freedom of the press, even though World Press Freedom Day is coming up on May 3rd. You know, last year I tried to get some major publications, including the Seattle Times and the Los Angeles Times, to print my article about the need for press freedom in the United States, and this report by Reporters Without Borders on their World Press Freedom Index of 2017, saying that we are 41st in the world in terms of press freedom. Not because of a state-owned media so much, but because of a corporate-owned media monopoly in this country, which has its own form of censorship. So there you go. Even though we're ranked 41st in the world in terms of press freedom, No major media outlet that I've worked with in the past will allow me to publish an article about press freedom. So what does that tell you? And I have tried. So I will try again because, May 3rd is coming up once more. And I really think that this is a universal international issue. There are a lot of organizations in Europe that are pushing these ideas of press freedom. There's the Committee to Protect Journalists, which is CPJ, and they do a lot of great work protecting the rights of journalists around the world. And there are many other great organizations. There's the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press. There's the European Commission on Media and Press Freedom. There's all sorts of groups, especially in Europe, that are really pushing this idea that in order to have a real democracy, you must have a free press. Now, in the United States, of course, we have a current administration that is not very friendly with the press and would like to call everything that's critical of their policies fake news, which is another issue that everyone is struggling with. What is fake news? Well, that depends on who's trying to spin it in their favor. That whole definition is controlled by people who have political agendas, and they will call anything fake news that doesn't fit their agenda. I'm not saying that there isn't fake news, like the people in New York would say. I'm just saying there is fake news. But a lot of the times when the president criticizes CNN or MSNBC or other news organizations for being fake news, it's only because their editorial reports and their news reports are counter to his policies. So that's why he calls them fake news. That's a typical autocratic move from leaders all over the world. And by the way, the three major superpowers in the world right now, in China, the United States, and Russia, are all autocrats. The president of China would like to be president for life. Vladimir Putin is supposedly on his last term there, but I'm sure he would like to overturn that and get another term and control power in Russia. He's basically eliminated his opposition, which is why he was elected in this recent election. And then in the United States, you have Donald Trump, who really believes in autocratic policies. He really believes that he should be the sole arbiter of what is fake news, what isn't, what is real, what isn't, what's politically correct and what isn't. And he doesn't like to listen to other people. That's very autocratic. So, unfortunately, the three superpowers have male leaders right now who think that they should be a dictator. And that is not good news for democracy around the world. In fact, last year, Reporters Without Borders did a satirical advertising campaign called "It's a Great Year for Dictatorships. It's a Great Year for Censorship." Right? That was their theme, because there were so many countries that were cracking down on freedom of the press and so many autocratic type regimes, including what's happening in Egypt right now and Turkey. So much for the Arab Spring in Egypt, right? Because now they're facing another autocratic ruler. And this is going on in many countries around the world. See, I'm saying that there are a lot of challenges that democratic nations need to face right now. Some of it comes from monopolization of the media by very wealthy interests or very conservative interests. Also, there's a lot of problems with the overreach of police authorities in all these countries. Surveillance of their own citizens is another issue that's really pushing back against democratic principles. There's a certain sense of a lack of accountability and transparency. Decisions made in secret are by an elite group that are not representatives of the people, is why the Romans decided to push this idea of res publica in the beginning, okay? It has to be public.
Join us as we delve into the deeper issues behind the news stories of the day on the MTC Report.
Don't go anywhere. The MTC Report with Mark Taylor-Canfield continues next.
you both explain the rise of authoritarianism? What's this coming from?
Well, I think the root of it is something that I haven't heard discussed much. I told a group today that in 1999, at the end of the last millennium, in the beginning of 2000, I was asked to make speeches in Oslo, Norway, and also in Taiwan. And my subject was, what is the greatest challenge to be faced by the next century? And I said the disparity between rich people and poor people. And I think that that is the case not only between people who live in a country, but also between nations. And I believe that the root of a downturn in human rights preceded 2016. It began earlier than that. And I think the reason was the disparity in income, which has been translated into the average person, you know, good, decent, hardworking, middle-class people feeling that they are getting cheated by the government and by society. And they don't get the same element of health care. They don't get the same quality education. They don't get the same political rights, particularly after the stupid decision of the Supreme Court on Citizens United, when it said that it's an unlimited amount of money going into campaigns. But now they feel that even in politics, their choice of a candidate to be president or governor or congressman or whoever is not the same as a rich person's. And also, once that candidate gets in office, if it's successful, quite often the average person feels that they are repaying their contributions with legal bribery, and it's legal. And the justice system has also gone down. Long before we had this last election, when I left the White House, for instance, 1 out of 1,000 people were in prison. Now, 7 people out of 1,000 are in prison. 7 times as many people who are Americans are now in prison as they were just when I left the White House. So the feeling of an average person that I'll be treated fairly by the justice system is missing. So, you know, basic human rights, income, status in society, health care, education, participation in politics, justice, the things in which we used to have complete faith now have been distorted by the rich people getting richer and the poor people getting poorer. And when the rich people get a candidate in office, they can be sure that the tax laws and everything else are going to keep them getting richer and richer, but the average person suffers. So I think that dissatisfaction with the existing system of politics resulted in the outcome of the election in 2016 in the United States. People were willing just to take a chance and to abandon democracy and what we know about is basic principles and try something new, no matter what it was.
Baby, won't you take me back? I'm not so bad. In fact, I bet you, honey, I'm the best you ever had. I may not have a nickel or a fancy degree, but when it comes to loving, hey, you get the best of me. I said I'll finally let you go now. I think I'm moving on, but I need to get my head straight and accept that you're gone. Because you don't want my loving anymore. I said you sold me down the river. It's a fast road to the shore. I said you sold me down the river. You don't want me anymore. Oh, well, you sold me down the river because you do not want my loving anymore.
So all of these issues, sunshine laws, campaign finance reform, they're all so important. Anything that pushes a pro-democracy movement in the United States is something, you know, that everyone should support right now. Because whether it's freedom of the press or voting rights, freedom of speech or religion, it's all very, very important right now that we stand up for our rights and that we elect people who are with the people and for the rights of the people and not just working for the Koch brothers or some wealthy elite, whoever they happen to be, right or left, right? We know that most of the media is controlled by those kinds of groups, That's why I push independent media so often, and that's why I try to do as much independent media as possible. Because free speech and freedom of the press is very important right now, and we need differing opinions. We need a diverse dialogue, political dialogue in the United States. It's been very two-sided, basically, for a long time between the Democrats and the Republicans. Some might say the two corporate parties, right? It's very difficult in the United States, by the way, for a third party that is not the Republicans or the Democrats to register their candidates for office across the country. There are all sorts of rules and restrictions that make it very difficult. It's also very expensive. You have to gather a certain amount of signatures to get your candidate on the ballot. There are all sorts of fees involved, which can sometimes be quite expensive. So unless you have a multi-million-dollar machine, and as you saw in my last MTC report, and unless, like Jimmy Carter stated, you can raise $200 million right off the bat, forget about your political career, right? It's a game for billionaires. That's where we're at in America. So that's also a major challenge to democracy. As far as I know, there's nothing in the United States Constitution that claims that only billionaires should be able to afford to run for office. But unfortunately, that's where we are at in the United States. And that's largely because of the Citizens United decision by the U.S. Supreme Court, which said that money is equated with free speech. So you can spend as much money as you want, and you don't even really have to document a lot of it. There's a lot of ways of laundering political money these days, which is why both Senator Bernie Sanders from Vermont, the Democratic candidate for president in 2016 or 2015 and 16, and Jimmy Carter, our former U.S. president, have both said that corruption is now legal in the United States. Political corruption is now legal. You can buy candidates, it doesn't matter, it's not even against the law. So in order to clean up this mess, first we have to pass laws against corruption, and that's hence the Anti-Corruption Act movement, which we included some videos from in my last MTC report explaining what that's about. But it's an attempt to pass campaign finance reform laws at the local level so that eventually we can go up to the county and state level and then nationally and get elected representatives to Washington, D.C. who are not corrupted and haven't been bought and sold. Because that's basically the story in the United States right now in terms of politics. Special interests and corporations, they buy and sell candidates. They bankroll candidates. They make it. It's all about the horse race, really. It's not about political philosophy or political platforms. It's about who has the most money. It's more of a sporting event, actually, an media event, a popularity contest. And that's another thing that people should realize. Democracy is not just a democracy is not just a popularity contest. It's not just about who's the most popular person. Because a lot of times in a democracy, a demagogue, and some might say our president, our current president is one of those, sometimes a demagogue is elected, right? And sometimes they aren't necessarily there to stand for, pro-democracy movements or, freedom of expression or freedom of speech or freedom of the press. Sometimes they're there to serve their own special interests, their own personal interests, or their own family interests. That's hence the oligarchy, that Jimmy Carter and Bernie Sanders have been talking about. Jimmy Carter basically said that a person like him, he's on MSNBC with Chris Matthews just recently. Jimmy Carter, our former president, said that it's impossible to be elected president the way that he did, using public finances. There was the $1 checkoff on people's income tax forms where you could voluntarily donate $1 to a public campaign finance project or program that would then finance the presidential elections, which is how Jimmy Carter ran. He didn't spend any money or raise any money outside of that. That's public campaign financing. That often happens in the UK such as during parliamentary elections, where it's not about which corporation can bankroll the candidate, because there's a very strict limit on how much can be spent by each candidate, and the money that is spent is publicly financed, so it's not coming from special interests. Those kinds of reforms are sorely needed in the United States. We also, of course, have this problem with the Electoral College, which is not democratic in itself. It goes back to the electors of Hanover, the Middle Ages of Europe, where there were certain people who held property and were considered aristocrats who were allowed to vote for who could become king. They were the electors. Well, in the United States, we have the Electoral College, which elected Donald Trump. Need I remind anyone that Hillary Clinton actually won the Democratic Party's candidate, Hillary Clinton, Secretary of State for the United States. She won the popular vote. It was not Donald Trump. Now, try to explain that to people from other countries who think that democracy is about, you know, the person with the majority of the vote wins. The Electoral College is a select group of people who are appointed in each state by their political parties, and they get to decide. Okay, so the fact that Hillary Clinton won the popular vote did not equate with her being elected the United States president. And that is a problem with democracy, folks. I was quoted in the Associated Press several years ago at least saying that the Electoral College needs to be abolished, abandoned, because it's not democratic. And then you get these arguments from people that, well, the reason the Electoral College exists is to make sure that someone who's not qualified to become president is elected. He's a businessman who didn't know anything about politics or what it takes to be a public servant. So there you go. He comes from a totally different world of unregulated capitalism where your friends always bail you out because they're rich and you're rich, and you just have this big party with the folks at Wall Street and make lots of money and try to keep it to yourself, right? And try to support candidates who will protect your best interests, which means keep your tax rates low, right? Get rid of those inheritance taxes and those things that, you know, bite into the wealthy's income or savings, you know, their investments. And, you know, try to make sure that you can, you know, scratch the backs of folks in the corporate world so that they will scratch your backs later after you leave office, which is kind of the goal, right? It's a revolving door. So that's why you get regulators who are like foxes, you know, watching the hen house. The very people who serve to gain from lax regulations become the regulators. And it's a corrupt system, okay? So I'm not going to deny that. I'm not the only one saying this, of course. There are a lot of people saying this. The point is, how do we fix it? And I think that, you know, the Anti-Corruption Act movement is one way. Campaign finance reform is very, very important. It's very, very important that we get authentic, ethical candidates in office, because this corruption has got to stop. And it's gone on too long, and democracy is suffering, and basically the middle class and poor folks in this country are really suffering. There are a lot of folks who are being pushed out of the electoral system. They are not allowed representation. There's a lot of gerrymandering going on and corrupt practices which do not represent true democracy. It represents corporate power and a lot of greedy, wealthy people, to tell you the truth. I mean, it'd be nice to have, you know, a few working class candidates out there, some teachers, some firefighters, you know, running for office, a carpenter or somebody, you know, that doesn't represent the elite upper class in this country. We need working class candidates, you know. And where's Spuds Terkel when you need him, right? The working class journalist. But yeah, I mean, I think part of the problem with the Democrats is that they've appealed to a sort of ivory tower of elitist neoliberals and forgot about the working class. And that's why somebody like Donald Trump was able to appeal to a lot of working class types and get their votes, whether they be independents or hardcore Republicans or libertarians or independents, or even maybe, you know, some disaffected Democrats or Bernie Sanders supporters who decided, you know, screw the Democrats, I'm going to vote for Trump. Well, it turns out that he is not draining the swamp. He's part of the swamp. He represents, you know, other billionaires in this country, not, you know, the working class. And people will figure that out sooner or later, you know. I mean, his administration is probably the most corrupt that has ever been in office. And, you know, I'm sorry, with all due respect to people who voted for him and people who support his agenda, it's been a mess ever since he took office. And you can't just blame the press, and you can't just blame the Democrats or Hillary Clinton for this. I'm sorry, it doesn't work. There's a lot of incompetence in Washington, D.C. on both sides. I'm not saying that it's only the Republicans. Believe me, I've been very critical of both political parties. I'm just saying that as residents of the United States, we deserve better, and I think we all know that. We need to restore our democracy, which means that every one of us has to take some responsibility for doing that, and that means, you know, contacting your elected representatives, showing up at city council meetings and county council meetings, writing to your state legislators and your Congress people, getting out there and helping to get the vote out when an important issue comes up in your community. We are all responsible for what happens. It's not just those people that we put in office, because it's human nature. Without pressure from us, they will serve their own best interests and the interests of those people who, bankrolled their election. So, this is not new. It's been going on, but we need great leaders today more than ever. And it's good to see that there's actually a youth movement actually happening out there now, which is great, to see students standing up to the NRA and other, special interests and their own, elected representatives. It's great to see that kind of courage, because that's what democracy relies on in a republic like a supposed republic like ours, is that, you must speak out and you must call attention to corruption wherever you can, and you must speak truth to power, because you can't expect our elected representatives to do that. They are serving their own best interests, which means, getting reelected or, staying in power. And it's just the nature of politics. We have to understand as, residents of this country that it's up to us to hold them accountable. And the corporations and whoever else, whatever other players and members of society are not doing the right thing. There are some very basic universal principles of what justice is, and lying and cheating and stealing is, and whatever ethical standard you go by, is just not acceptable. Okay, it leads to suffering by innocent folks who don't deserve to suffer. So we need to eliminate as much of that as possible. We need to stand for justice in this country and live up to our democratic principles, which were part of the reason that we became independent from Great Britain in the beginning and the British Empire. We didn't like kings, we didn't like monarchies, we didn't like that kind of elitist, aristocratic rule. So we must ask ourselves, how have we gotten to this place where these, oligarchs now run our country, and, a few billionaires control our destiny? It's not fair, it's not right, and it's not what democracy is supposed to be about. Okay, everyone is supposed to have a voice, and the media should not be monopolized by corporations who have a political interest in mind. It should be open and independent to many different voices. And, buyer beware. There is fake news out there, and you must learn discernment. You must become proactive about your processing and consuming of media. You must be the person, who does the research. You can't just leave it up to the journalist or the editor, because they may not be telling you the truth. Unfortunately, you have to decide for yourself. For each website and each news report and each YouTube channel, look behind the scenes and find out who those people are and what their agenda is and how authentic and legitimate are they, because not everyone is, of course. Some of us try to tell the truth as the best we know how. Other folks have a different agenda, and you as a consumer of media must be literate and educated about media and about propaganda, and about spin and corporate advertising, so that you understand what messages are being fed to you and you can decode them. That's the whole point of being an educated consumer of media. You must decode the messages that are being thrown at you, regardless of where they're coming from, whether it's a political party or a government or a corporation or a religion or a non-profit agency. There's all sorts of people that are trying to buy your vote, convince you that their agenda is ultimately the only important one, and that you must join them. So that's the state of the union in the United States right now, and you as media consumers and us as media creators must, try to be clear about these issues and not let it become obfuscated and confusing for people who are trying to understand what's going on. It's already way too confusing out there, so some of us need to be clear about what's going on. We all have our biases, we all have our own way of thinking. I do not claim to have a corner on truth. I have an opinion, and you're welcome to it anytime you like, and you're also welcome to disagree with me. I mean, that is the nature of a democratic republic, right? All voices need to be heard, even if you don't like them. But then you decide for yourself what you think the truth is, and hope that things are not being censored so that you're getting all the information. That's the problem with censorship, right? Because now your information is being filtered and you don't know the truth because it's being kept from you. So how can you make an educated decision, an intelligent decision, a common sense decision if you don't know what the truth is? That's why we need transparency and accountability in government, and in corporations, and in schools, and any other enterprise we enter into as a community. There are some basic rules of ethics that must be followed. And unfortunately, in politics and in the media in the United States, a lot of those ethical guidelines have been thrown aside, unfortunately. And it's a no holds barred, it's like the Wild West again when it comes to information, total chaos, actually, and anarchy. And, there's a way of sharing information without trying to proselytize or brainwash people. Let people decide for themselves what to think. That's my motto, right? I don't like to be told what to think or how to think or what to believe. I like to be given information so that I can decide for myself, and I hope that my audience does the same. I hope you are all willing to educate yourselves and have an open mind, but also be able to see, when people are trying to deceive you. It's very, very important that you understand the nature of the information you're being given and why you're being given it, and the context of it and the history behind it, right? Because it all has a context and it all has a background, and if you don't know that, then it's kind of hard to understand where you stand with it and what its objectives are, and how to maintain your own sense of identity. I believe that most people have common sense and can decide for themselves if given the correct information, if given the full information on the situation. So anyway, this is Mark Taylor-Canfield for the MTC report, and I really appreciate you listening. We have a lot of work to do, and I haven't given up hope. I think that the United States of America and its democratic principles that it was founded on are very much worthwhile, and I think that's been reflected in pro-democracy movements around the world since 1776, that we really need to stand true to those principles and not allow things, to take us away from them, or to pervert them, or create hypocrisy as it has in the past with things like slavery, right? I mean, all men are created equal. Well, all men, women, children, hopefully all species on the planet are created equal in some way, at least in terms of respect for their existence. But, we still have a long ways to go. We are always growing as a society, and I think we can do better than we have been recently. But I also believe that a lot of people have come to terms with that and are waking up to that reality. So that's a good sign. This is Mark Taylor-Canfield for the MTC report in Seattle, and I want to thank you for tuning in. And if you like what we're doing here, then definitely like this video. Subscribe to our channel if you haven't already, and if you have, then thank you so much. And share it on social media and let other people know what we're doing here. And we'll see you next time. And keep a curious mind, and definitely ask questions, because like I said, media is all about trying to convince you of something, and if you don't understand what the agenda is of the folks behind it, then you may become duped by them. I don't plan to dupe anyone. I just plan to state my opinion and let you decide for yourself. This is Mark Taylor-Canfield for the MTC report. Thanks so much for watching, and I will see you next time. Thank you.
The MTC Report, the news behind the news with journalist Mark Taylor-Canfield. We offer you independent voices and underreported stories about topics you won't hear anywhere else on the MTC Report.